I'm Ashley Cataldo, Curator of Manuscripts at the American Antiquarian Society, and it is our privilege to host a symposium celebrating both the bicentennial of the publication of Cooper's novel The Spy and the textual editing process used to create a definitive scholarly edition of his works. I'm here with two of the original editors on this project, Lance Schachterle, Professor of American Studies and English at Worcester Polytechnic Institute, and James Elliott, Professor of English at Clark University. Lance, please start by telling us a bit about your own background and how you came to the Cooper Project.
Thank you, Ashley. When I finished my dissertation at Penn on the serialization techniques Charles Dickens had developed for all his novels, I came to WPI in 1970. I was interested then in continuing my research into Dickens' methods of production. And in fact, the British were just beginning a comprehensive edition of his works. But when I got in contact with them, I discovered that because most of the materials available for that edition were in England, they were not looking to recruit any American scholars. Happily, that same year, I met James Franklin Beard, who had just finished completing his definitive edition of the letters and journals of James Fenimore Cooper. And Beard persuaded me I should shift my allegiance in editing from Dickens to Cooper. I did so, and Jim, with the help of Jay Elliott, the textual editor, taught me all I needed to know about both Cooper and editing. I began with Cooper's third important novel, The Pioneers, which I finished work on in 1980. Shortly after that, Jay and I undertook a much larger project, The Spy. We worked on that for 15 or so years until we finally were able to bring the whole project together with the appropriate computer files, which were published in 2002. That year, I also succeeded K. Seymour House as the editor-in-chief of the Cooper edition. We had lost the sponsorship of SUNY Press when Jim Beard died, but Kay had managed to find us a new publisher, AMS Press of New York. I oversaw the publication of 8 new Cooper titles with AMS Press before, unfortunately, they went bankrupt. Happily, we were able to resume sponsorship from SUNY Press, and the SUNY Press presently is publishing new Cooper titles as well as republishing the titles no longer available with AMS Press. I have to date co-edited 6 titles of Cooper's, and I'm working with Jay Elliott on my 7th title, Cooper's penultimate sea novel, The Sea Lions.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Lance. Jay, could you tell us some of your own background and how you came to the project?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Ashley. I was hired at Clark in 1971, directly out of graduate school. Jim Beard was looking for a member of the department to be able to move into his fledgling Cooper edition, but he needed someone with some kind of experience and expertise in textual editing to be able to contribute to the Cooper project. I had just finished my dissertation at Indiana. It was an edition of a Howells novel called The Quality of Mercy, which had a full manuscript. And I learned just through being a research assistant at that edition for 3 years, a lot of information about the textual editing and a lot of procedures and so forth. So Jim wanted me to move into the Cooper edition as quickly as possible. He and I had many conversations about the kinds of problems that the Cooper, editing the Cooper volumes might present and the kinds of solutions that we could present for those. So I've had, as textual editor of the edition and then eventually chief textual editor, I've had my hand in any number of the volumes. My major contribution was the editing of the Leatherstocking tale, The Prairie, which was complicated because it had manuscript and a amanuensis copy and was published initially in France. But so far, we've just been publishing as many as we could, and I've been trying to make myself as available as possible for all kinds of textual problems and solutions.
Thanks, Jay. Could you now tell us about what makes the spy so important in the canon of Cooper's works and in the scholarly edition of the writings of James Fenimore Cooper?
Yes, thanks, Ashley. The Spy, his second novel, was the first popular novel that Cooper wrote. And for one thing, it solidified his position or his attitude about himself as a popular author. His first novel, Precaution, was not did not sell very well, was not very popular. But The Spy was an immediate hit, an immediate bestseller. We might even call it America's first bestseller. It's important because it's a historical novel that uses actual historical events. Cooper was familiar with the landscape. He heard tales from Revolutionary War veterans. But the most important aspect of the novel, the germ of the novel, if you will, is something that he wrote about for the introduction to the British Bentley Standard Novels edition. And he recounts an anecdote from John Jay, who oversaw espionage for the Continentals during the Revolutionary War. Jay recalled a principal agent whom he directed, a common man who refused to be rewarded after the war. This is the quotation that Cooper uses from Jay. Persuasion was useless, for patriotism was uppermost in the heart of this remarkable individual. And Mr. Jay departed, bearing with him the gold he had brought, and a deep respect for the man who had so long hazarded his life unrequited for the cause they served in common. This was the model for Harvey Birch. Cooper was able to embed Harvey in a landscape and a set of characters that he had at least very, very clear secondhand knowledge of. And that's one of the reasons why I think it made such an impression, because a lot of people could identify with the kinds of scenes and characters that he was depicting here. And it was a success, as I said. It was almost immediately dramatized as a measure of its popular success. And Cooper knew then that he could make a living as an author. All right, thanks.
Great. And Lance, what are the major pieces of evidence that we have of Cooper's involvement in the various editions of the novel?
Well, because as Jay just said, the popularity of the novel led to a number of reprints throughout Cooper's life. We have evidence both from his letters and from the actual subsequent texts, which we as editors have identified as containing authorial revisions. Early on in his career, when he was still collaborating with his first publisher, Goodrich, over Precaution, he wrote to Goodrich on the 8th of July, 1820, that he had a new project in mind, which, in comparison to which Precaution is, quote, so very, very inferior to the Spy. And he went on to say that Precaution is, quote, a highly moral book, which by the by, the Spy is not. And then he said, I believe it will sell. 4 days later, he excitedly wrote Goodrich again, quote, the Spy goes on slowly and will not be finished until late this fall. I take more pains with it, as it is to be professedly an American novel. I think it is far better than Precaution, more interest, and better writing. Well, 20 years later, when he was recalling his career to a correspondent, Rufus Griswold, he told a slightly different tale about how the Spy, quote, a copy of the first volume, bound, lay about my house several weeks before a line of the second was thought of. He wrote the last chapter and had it, quote, printed and paged before several of the preceding chapters were even conceived of, to make sure that he could make the publication deadline from his eager publisher, Wiley and Howstead in New York. On the 7th of December, 1822, Charles Wiley was able to write excitedly to Cooper, quote, the first edition of the novel published on 22nd December 1821, quote, had succeeded over and beyond my own expectations, and they were not easily to be exceeded. And a friend of Cooper's, C.K. Gardner, wrote to him in the same month of January, informing him that he had heard from Wiley that Cooper was working hard on a significant piece of literature. Interestingly, Gardner later was one of Cooper's first reviewers and pointed out some of the mistakes that unfortunately turned up in the first edition. Well, we know that the first edition sold out quite quickly from Wiley's letter, and Cooper therefore had the opportunity in the second edition, second New York edition from Wiley, published in March 1822, to make revisions. Those revisions would have been made on handset type, as the image shows here, and until our research, bibliographers thought that the second edition was simply a line-by-line, letter-by-letter reprint of the first. But using a Hinman collator, Jay and I were able to determine that there are significant variants in the second edition. And as we'll be discussing later, many of those variants we considered to be authorial corrections of errors in the first edition. Well, the second edition did well. And on May 1822, Cooper and Wiley issued a third edition with even more changes. A fourth Wiley edition occurred in 1824, but it did not have any significant changes in it. Cooper's next opportunity to make major changes in the novel came when he began working with the premier London publisher, Charles Colburn. He wrote this letter to Colburn in April of 1831, stating his terms to provide a thorough revision of The Spy and add footnotes. And he made a comment which really stands for all of Cooper's experiences with typesetters throughout his career. The proofreader must be careful and consult the sense, for it is possible in the haste which you have exacted, I may have made one mistake in correcting another. The book was full of faults, and I'm amazed to see how many had crept in through the carelessness of the printers, though heaven knows there were enough of my own. We have actually in the Cooper files at the Antiquarian Society a very important microfilm of a mass of business papers which the Cooper family had collected. And Ashley has recovered the actual memorandum of agreement made in April of 1831 between Cooper and Colburn and Bentley for that revised edition. Cooper asked Colburn and Bentley to take the most recent Lee and Carey Philadelphia edition and literally to tear the edition apart and have blank pieces of paper interleaved with the pages and then bound back together. We're fortunate that at the Berg collection of the New York Public Library, that interleaved text still exists. And it was crucial for Jay and me in doing our editorial project to see, literally have physical evidence of the kinds of changes that Cooper made in what became the Bentley Standard Novel edition of The Spy in 1831. We'll look at the middle one first here. Here, Cooper is adding one of 30 or so footnotes to the Bentley edition. The intent of these footnotes was to define terms and situations that Cooper anticipated might not be familiar to his British audiences. But this particular footnote is one of several that kind of twists the British lion's beard by pointing out the originality of America. This footnote reads, the paper money issued by Congress was familiarly called continental money. The term continental was applied to the Army, the Congress, the ships of war, and in short, to almost everything of interest which belonged to the new government. It would seem to have been invented as the opposite of the insular position of the mother country. And you recall part of the propaganda from the Revolutionary War was, we are in America, a whole continent. How can a teeny island boss us around? The correction at the bottom is an example of his changing the register in the way in which certain characters are presented. Our heroine, who was previously represented as a guileless girl, as a maiden, now becomes the guileless girl. And we find most amusing the parenthetical comment at the top. There's a character in The Spy named Isabella Singleton. She develops a most unwholesome romance with the heroine's boyfriend. And in the 18th century, women are not supposed to form amatory relations with males before the male gives the signal. She's a pest throughout the novel. And when she dies from a stray bullet shot, Cooper wrote in the margins of the interleaved copy a sentiment readers then and now probably enjoy. I'm damn glad she's dead. Cooper had one more occasion at the very end of his life to provide revisions to The Spy. A new prominent New York publisher, George Palmer Putnam, had emerged in the late 40s and undertook with Cooper to do a complete edition of all of Cooper's writings in the format which he had previously done for Washington Irving. The Putnam edition contains far fewer revisions in it than any of the previous ones, but as we will see when we talk about how we had to go through all the texts and identify variants between the first text and all subsequent ones, there are some changes that we incorporated in our synthetic edition from the Putnam edition, the last in Cooper's lifetime that he was able to revise.
Great, thank you, Lance. Now can we go into you both describing your process for editing The Spy?
Yeah, let me talk about the historical collation first. What we had to do, first of all, was make collations, collate the first edition, the Wiley and Halstead first edition, against each one of the subsequent authorial editions. That is the second edition of the Wiley, the third edition of the Wiley, the interleaved copy, and finally the Putnam copy. And those are all in columns here that collect together all of those variants, the history, basically, of all of the variants and where they appear. It's a kind of flow chart, really, an historical conflation for every single variant that showed up in all of these authorial editions. Now, note too that we're talking about authorial editions, that is, editions that we can demonstrate or have very good reason to assume that Cooper had a hand in the preparation or had something to do with its revision. Now, it's very easy to see, of course, with the interleaved copy, but we had to make some kind of editorial distinction between those changes in the second and third Wiley edition and in the Putnam edition from 1851, because we do not have his hand. We do not have the advantage of seeing his writing, his own hand, as we did in the interleaved copy. But making historical collation enabled us to be able to see what kinds of changes, what the groupings of changes might be, how we might characterize these variants, these changes, and whether or not we could determine with some degree of accuracy whether or not they were authorial changes or not. Because after all, consider the fact that the second and third Wiley editions were not reprints rather, but resettings of type by hand, and thus would also incorporate compositorial error, as well as Cooper's own possible corrections and revisions in proof. So we had to find a way of trying to distinguish between those two simply by looking at the variants in the second and third Wiley editions. Lance, you want to talk about the stemma?
After we had compiled all of the variants among the texts that possibly were candidates for Cooper's revision and had made decisions about which subsequent editions were in fact authorially revised, we created this stemma. First thing to appreciate from this is how many editions the spy went through between 1821 and at the very end, 1859. The texts on the left emanate from the first edition and are texts that we know Cooper played a role in revising. Looking at the text on the left, our first edition, the A edition, is our copy text of 22nd December 1821. That's the source for the B edition, March 22, the C edition, May 22, and then when Charles Wiley reprinted the text in 1824, he used the 1822. In turn, as I said, Cooper caused the Wiley edition to be cut up and used as the copy text for the preparation of the interleaved copy that eventually led to the revised Colburn and Bentley edition in London. That then in turn, our collations showed that following Cooper's instructions, when Putnam reprinted the spy in 1849, he followed what Cooper told him was the most accurate edition to date, the Colburn and Bentley. But interestingly, the texts on the right are all piracies. They're examples of how popular Cooper was. He was pirated, that is to say, publishers got a hold of an American or London text and reprinted it without his permission in London, Paris, Zwickau, and several other places. Good evidence of Cooper's popularity being established by the spy. And of course, one of Cooper's major reasons of going to Europe between 1826 and 1833 was to stop all this, to make sure that he met with all these European publishers and that they came under contractual obligations to him.
Thank you, Lance. Now, can we talk about who W.W. Gregg was and how he defined variants?
Yes, I mentioned before that when we are looking in the collations, when we do not have the author's hand to be able to tell us exactly what that author did and where, we come up with variants from the collation, that is, changes that are exhibited from edition to edition. But we have, how do we determine, how do we separate an authorial revision from some kind of error, because after all, these are all hand-typed, hand-set, and subject to compositorial error, as well as other kinds of potential problems with handset type. And W.W. Gregg came up with a solution, an editorial solution when he was working on Shakespeare, editing Shakespeare. And we now know it as the Gregg Bowers editorial policies. The major thing that he tried to do, that he suggested, is that we can make a determination between variance in a text between substantives and accidentals. What these basically suggest is that substantives are changes in wording, basically. Some kind of changes in wording and phrasing. Accidentals, on the other hand, are changes in punctuation and in certain circumstances, spelling and paragraphing. Note that when Bentley publishes the novel, even with the interleaved copy, he's going to make most of the OR endings, which are American, which Cooper would have used, OUR. That's an accidental change. That's due to the kinds of print policies that he followed in England. So what we need to do then is to try to determine which changes might be major changes, that is, changes in words or wording. This is just a very general kind of classification, and those changes in spelling, punctuation, etc. It also means that we would have a copy text. So this is the theory of copy text. The rationale behind using the first earliest possible version of a text, whether it be manuscript or first edition or what have you. But the earliest is because that most clearly reflects the author's preference for and use of the accidentals, of the punctuation and the spelling and so forth. So we use that early text as the copy text. And into that copy text, we insert all of those changes that we determine in one way or another are authorial. And that way we can ignore, as it were, the stuff that compositors and proofreaders and so forth enter into the text in terms of styling, etc. And we retain what the author actually writes, we think, and what the author actually revises. We can demonstrate, and it has been demonstrated, that handset compositors will make lots of changes according to the styling that they've been directed at, but they are very careful usually to reproduce the content of the work that they are setting. And that's basically what determines the principle between the distinction in the principle of copy text editing, the distinction between the substantive changes and accidental changes. That's one thing that we did try to elaborate in the editorial principles and procedures that Jim Beard and I wrote, I think back in the 1970s, not exactly sure, but it was a way of trying to suggest how we were adapting the Gregg Bowers copy text theory of textual editing to the particular facts and conditions of the Cooper volumes. Here's the rejected readings.
Rejected readings are variants that the editors determine to be non-authorial. Sometimes they're lapses simply misspelled words. Other times there's slight word variants that do not significantly change the text. And in light of the massive evidence we got about the kinds of extensive changes that Cooper made when he did intervene in a text, it's pretty easy to see that the variants are much simpler, fewer and far between than the emendations. On the left here, you have A through H. Those are the symbols of the 8 editions that we had to use from the stemma to be able to trace the genetic flow of the variants from 1821 to 1849. And on the right, we have some examples of words that we rejected. You'll see if you look at that list that looking on the right-hand side of the entry, many of the variants originate in edition D. Well, D is that 1824 Wiley edition that we know Cooper did not make any revisions for. So looking at the first example here at 260.29, the D compositor put in expressively for Cooper's impressively. Well, there's a difference there. And since Cooper had no hand in preparing the D text, we rejected that. The most interesting rejections, however, on this list are cases where compositors, as they often do, substituted regular spellings for dialect words and pronunciations. So again, looking at this list at 265.30, the copy text has year, Y-E-E''R. Well, a later compositor saw no reason to put that dialect speaker, but the compositor normalized that to UR. That kind of change occurs again on this list at 267.9, 276.39, 277.9, 278.12, and several other places. We have found as Cooper editors that Cooper always increased the dialect when he was making revisions. We have examples of that from the Bentley Standard Novel Holograph revisions. Cooper increases dialect. We've never found any examples in a text that Cooper worked on that he decreased dialect. So it's always been our policy in doing emendations and rejected readings to reject the regularization of dialect, which was so important for Cooper for establishing the background of the character as a speaker.
Here's an example of an emendation which is made in several times at the same point in the text. This is a revision of what seems to be an error of some kind or another. That is that in the first edition, we have the appearance of the surgeon's cigar box, which having comfortably established it in the corner of his mouth, he's smoking the box rather than the cigar. And that was something that Edward Everett noticed in a review in North American Review in July 1821 and called attention to. However, in the second edition, for the second edition, Cooper had already noticed that and made the change, omitting box there and just printing the appearance of the surgeon's cigar, which having comfortably established it in the corner of his mouth, may be a little bit awkward, but at least he's not smoking the box. It was revised further in the third edition, now because the surgeon's cigar is comfortably established in the corner of his mouth, being comfortably established in the corner of his mouth. And then in the interleaved copy for the Bentley edition in 1831, Cooper omitted comfortably. So it's a way of suggesting how he pays attention even to a small detail over a period of time and over several revisions. Now, for our synthetic text, for our Cooper text, we choose the last edition, the last revision, rather. The last revision, because that's his latest judgment. That's Cooper's latest judgment as far as what he wants his language to convey at that point. Now, this is a much longer substitution of a whole passage. It just follows the cigar box episode. But here, Cooper is shifting an emphasis from the surgeon, Archibald Sitgreaves, to Captain Lawton in causing the exit of Miss Peyton and the women attending her. So Cooper pays attention both to the very small detail, removing comfortably in the interleaved copy, but here he substitutes a whole passage for a revision of emphasis, a change of emphasis, and a shift in characterization.
Thank you. So now, finally, we just want to sort of talk about what your overall goal in creating this scholarly edition was.
Yeah, thank you, Ashley. We take as our motto for what we do in the Cooper edition yet another text that he wrote to his very first publisher about his very first book in 1820. Here Cooper wrote, "I wish to have my own language printed, having quite as much faith in my own taste as that of any printer in the Union. Let them give me a fair chance. The work is mine, and I am willing to keep the faults. Let the work be literally my own. They cannot possibly understand my meaning as well as myself." So what we have done over the history of the Cooper edition is in the review of the subsequent variants between the first edition and any subsequent editions where we know from internal or external evidence that Cooper played a role in preparing, we have tried to, as Jay has just indicated, select those readings subsequent to the first that seem to bear evidence of the kind of revisions Cooper makes, and correspondingly to eliminate any subsequent variants after the first edition that are the work of the printer.
And just finally, what work do you think still remains to be done?
Well, from the very beginning of the Cooper edition, it was policy to print a clear text. That is, unlike some editions, the reader will encounter in any one of our editions a text that has no footnotes in it other than the author's. So if someone wants to know the results of the labors of the editor, they have to look at the apparatus at the back that lists all of the emendations and rejected readings. It would be really nice to have digital text with a hypertext link that would enable readers, for example, of that cigar box episode, to note when they're reading that text that Cooper revised that 3 times subsequently, and with a hyperlink, be able to see what those different variant emendations are, rather than having to look for them all the way at the end of the text. It would be also nice along those lines to have the kind of fluid text that John Bryant has envisioned for Melville. We've seen several essays in which scholars have looked at the revisions that Cooper made over the course of the years with The Spy, and have looked at such issues as how Cooper treats African Americans differently in later editions, how he reduces the vulgarity of Harvey Birch, how he tweaks the gentlemanliness of George Washington, and having that kind of fluid text to see the sequential changes through history as Cooper tweaks, he doesn't re-envision, he never changes the plot of any of his novels, but how he re-envisions the impact certain characters and scenes will have on their audiences would be very valuable.
That would be especially true, I think, with the Bentley Standard novels. Those novels were commissioned for a British audience. He revised them with a British audience in mind. He put in footnotes for a British audience. A fluid text might be able to show us even more precisely and completely how he was shifting certain emphases to make his work more popular and even palatable to a British audience. But I would be curious to see a fluid text that might give me that kind of data, that kind of information.
At the left, we see a very small portion of the enormous holdings at the American Antiquarian Society of both contemporary and modern editions of Cooper's work. I would encourage anyone interested in pursuing other texts that the Cooper edition has compiled to look at the URL at the top right. It's a reference to the writings of James Fenimore Cooper, where we discuss in detail each of our textual editions, as well as provide other information of interest to people who want to explore Cooper further.
Fantastic. Thank you, Lance and Jay, both for this great discussion about the history of the editing of The Spy. Please join us on May 25th and 26th virtually at AAS for a symposium on the bicentennial of the publication of The Spy. It's called Textual Editing and the Future of Scholarly Editions, a conference on the bicentennial of James Fenimore Cooper's The Spy.